Okay, I think we're all set. Greetings. This is Shahida Ahmed, your host for the Wombs, Wells, and Waterways YouTube channel. And I wanted to set up for our Maritime Record Spotlight. And we often will do like a record spotlight every so often, just as a clip to give you a brief introduction to a record set that you may or may not have looked at, or you may or may not have looked at it in this way. And so, one of the records that's really important in looking at African American in the sea men's certificate kind of way, meaning they are participatory in the maritime history, but they also form the infrastructure of it. And so, if you're not aware of this document, which is called the Seaman's Certificate, become familiar because if you are researching ancestors that are in the what I would call the coastal regions of the United States and other regions also across the world. It's important to take a closer look at that because it may be a way to find information about your ancestor, especially when you've been kind of trained to only think of census records as your main source or records that do not go beyond 1870. Siemens records are one of those record sets that do go back into the world of, hey, um, I was here back in the 1700s even. And so really tracing your ancestors in that manner can broaden your scope and actually give you more information about some of the decisions and reasons you're finding your ancestors in different places. So if you're not aware, the Siemens, it's called the Siemens Protection Certificate, and I'll pull up a screen shortly to show you what that looks like. But let me just tell you a little bit about it in general. So first of all, it was introduced in different rounds, like it was discontinued in one form and then reissued or reopened in another form. And so to have a Siemens certificate actually means you were on the water. It's not as official as it became later, where it became connected to more of a kind of a federal regulation or a state regulation. So what was happening way back in the day was, first of all, African Americans were not considered citizens of the United States. Okay, go figure. But now we're starting to think about um, things like pirating, um, things like, oh, you're traveling in the ocean, you're not on any particular piece of land, right? And who's to say that if your boat was captured or it was stranded in another region of the world, that they with regard to African Americans had to abide by the law of America, that they were in fact still enslaved, that they were in fact belonging to, in some respect, the United States or what was to become the United States of America. Who's to say that? And so oftentimes ships were being captured by vessels from other regions, Portugal, Spain, all of these different places. And they would capture the people and they would, these Americans would say, these captains would say, hey, they belong to us. And they were like, well, show me. Like, how they don't even have citizenship in your country. How are you to say you have claim to this person? So of course, what usually happens in, in America, like while many of us are stuck in the like the rah-rah of going back and forth, the the gears start to move in terms of legislation that needs to be passed. And in 1796, Congress authorized this creation of what was no longer, what was didn't exist before, a Seamen's Protection Certificate. We probably are more connected to that kind of pathway if we were to think about passports, right? To be stranded somewhere and not have your passport, it's almost like, how do I get there? You can't even get into the country, much less leave it if you do not have the proper identification or come back to. And so those things were just as important then as we think of our passport now. And so in some regards, this particular protection certificate was designed by Congress to prevent foreigners from kidnapping or impressing American mariners. But more so, it actually, if you were to think about the impact and the labor force that really secured the maritime industry, you will really realize that it has everything to do with Africans and African American labor. And inside of that, whether you are a captain or you own the ship, that's neither here or there, but who was actually going to get the ship where it needed to go? Also, there were quite a few of African Americans that were captains of vessels, even while being enslaved, even for free people. So they were running their own um I guess team is not the right word, but it's slipping my mind right now. In terms of running an entire ship, they would have their crew. They were all Black crews. Often you could run across that, and that was not a strange occurrence. And so when we start to think about the Seaman Certificate as a record set, what we want to think about is what are some of the things that this record set tells us. And so, first of all, before we get to that, is that these records, these applications or certificates were issued by U.S. Customs. And so, for the most part, they could, they don't all look the same, depending upon the country. That's one, but also depending upon the port. They always had their own like brand or their marking. So one certificate may look different than another. So keep that in mind. But for the most part, you could get s- great data from it. So such as, of course, the name of the sailor or seaman, excuse me, um, the seaman's age, height. Often they use some type of description to talk about body scars or complexion, things that would make it very difficult because not all semen certificates had photographs. There are some, and I find more recent ones that have them, and I mean recent as in early 1900s. But if you go back to 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s, you can find some, but they're not as frequent. So they needed descriptions, and so oftentimes, if you can imagine, I know from looking through the whaling history of New England, like African Americans would be in this life or death industry, and then when they get to some place like Cape Verde or the Horn of Africa, we are starting to look at like they getting there and switching their papers with someone who was also desperate to get a job on the ship. And so it was kind of their pathway to freedom in a different way. So they could often be, switching papers, getting paid to, use someone else's papers. And so while it wasn't like a whole, 100% proof process, those things happened. And so you can easily think about an ancestor that's going under another person's name, traveling on the ship. And that happened quite frequently. So, uh, those are some information parts. Now, in the later versions, so I would say maybe early 1900s, You can also find birthplace of your parents, the name of your father, things of that sort that would also identify names that can often be too common to sift through. If you're going so far back, it can be very difficult to think about, hey, wait, is this William Johnson that I'm related to, or is this just a William Johnson that's from, you know, that's also from the same state? And so when it starts to point to a specific parent and where that parent is from, that gave valuable information. So in the earlier days, the part of the process was to get your application approved was that you had to have a witness to kind of verify that you were born where you said you were born. And I'll show you a little bit of that. But um, the other part is very often when you're searching online for certificates, I know Ancestry and Family Search probably does too, but these records can be have different forms in different spaces or different sites or virtual spaces. But for the most part, a lot of people will say we don't have as many, or they will have what is called an index, somewhat of a spreadsheet that came from an original source of some sort. And that's kind of what most people are looking at, but I encourage you to look at if the original document is available, take a look at it, look it over and see if there's a picture. I'll show you a few that do have pictures, but they were just a means of identification. And it is said that in terms of African Americans in America, that this was one of the first markers that identified them as citizens of this country. And so that's a huge thing in terms of how their brothers and sisters who were not seamen were still not identified as such. So there was no like all for one, one for all kind of thing. If you were a seaman, they were afraid that they were going to lose what would considered their property. So let me share. Okay. So I'm just giving you a small preview of records that relate to seaman records. So this is from the National Archives, and I hope my volume is up. Just make sure. It says you can hear me. All right. So in terms of the uh certificate, this is one version of it. And this is something that came from a period between 1796 and 1840. This particular one, and I'm going to zoom in a bit. Um, this one is, it says in the year of our Lord, 1797, right? So we're looking at the certificates. And so here it usually has the person's name, right? Even in, I won't go into it today as our focus is on seaman certificates, but you can find passport records also online, which is not specific to seamen, just people who are traveling out of the country. Well, in that, you can still find information that shows that they had to vouch, especially for African Americans. They had to be vouched for in terms of that they would be returning to America, right? Something had to be said that this is not a forever thing. So here we are. We have the seaman's name. We also have their age at this time. So that gives you a little bit more information about their birth, which you may not find for African American on the census record, or depending upon the time period, anyone on the census record. So they do tell you about their height. And let me get a little highlighter here. Um, so we're looking at information about their height, 5 feet, 4.5 inches. That's pretty exact, 4.5. And the complexion, a light complexion. Now, just because you find a semen that has a dark complexion, that is possibly has the descriptions will make you say, what? They had, words like rusty, blacky, colored, and different, even more creative expressions for how a person's hair's texture looks. And so that also did not necessarily mean, remember, in maritime culture, just because they look like they're probably black, they probably are descendants of Africans or have part of the diaspora in that way. But it didn't necessarily mean that they were African American. Quite a few people who were listed as Mexican nationality will have that same feature from Cape Verde, same features that they could be from Africa even. And so the Caribbean, all of these places essentially it's almost like you don't know where any one particular person's life started necessarily, but they are classified as some type of nationality. And it's not a giveaway that they are in fact American in that regard. So and then it was given as terms of the date and the person who actually signed off on the certificate, right? And so there's just so many different categories. So we have they're very this is very old, but they're just this looks a little different, right? This one pretty typical, but it also tells you that this was for the District of Baltimore. We're looking at and pay closer attention to areas of port cities. Nathaniel Lee. And I have an excerpt from where they talk a little bit about how proofs of citizenship was done in this in the National Archives catalog where they look a little bit more closely. I actually was able to find my great my two times great grandfather was a seaman, and I found out through a back door. I'm just searching and it just came up as a possibility when I'm doing a general search. And I said, why don't I look up this person? And when I found out, being from Charleston, South Carolina, he was part of that coastal region. And inside of that, I was able to get a photograph of him. And this is my two times great grandmother's brother. So that goes pretty far back. And that was an amazing piece. And to know that I would probably not have found him directly, as his name is very common, but also finding out that he eventually, because of his waterways connection, he ended up living where he docked, where he worked on the ship. He ended up living there and never coming back to South Carolina. And so that's really a cool aspect of things. So the next part I want to show you, I do have, let me just make sure. Oops. Um, I thought I did have oh, I do have it, but I will show it in a few minutes. Let's first go into some of these protection certificates that are probably more recent. This is through Ancestry, U.S. application for semen protection certificates, 1960 to 1940. And if you have an ancestor that was born in the late 1800s, they could possibly be in this pool. And so, as just to show you, and I chose someone because I'm like, if you don't know, I do a lot of research in the North Carolina area. And what I mean by North Carolina area is really centered around my interest in, ooh, it just keeps enlarging so fast. really inside of the maritime culture of North Carolina. It's not the only place I research, but it's one of interest right now. And so here's a semen certificate. It looks different, right? But we're looking for those key data markers, the name. Um, it has the place of birth, Edenton, North Carolina. If you saw my last video, I was looking at a seaman from that same town. And so some towns I am just already aware of the communities that live there. And so I know I can find African American people there. So in certain towns more easily than others. And so it says that he had two affidavits. So he had two people on his behalf give testimony that he is in fact from this town, or more so from America. So this they tell the vessel that he was traveling on, what flag it was on there, and where he docked. This was interesting. When I looked up to find, so some of, and I'll go into it, but some of these, when you search for semen records, you're not able to find, you can filter out by the location of where these records were issued from. So in this case, I couldn't find North Carolina for this particular time period, but I searched for the nearest state, which I know a little bit more about the geography of this particular part of North Carolina. So Norfolk, Virginia came up. But look at this. So the ship is that's where the ship docked, but it was so common for people to who lived in that Albemarle Sound community to go for work in Norfolk. So that's not a stretch for me. It tells what his rank was or what he did as a messman. And often that's not indicative of his entire journey as a seaman. So that's also important. And that'll be another clip to talk about occupations, which is really interesting. Um, and it talks about, his complexion, his hair color, his eyes, and physical marks. It says there's a scar at the base of his middle finger, and something else here. Uh, it also, he's something on his left, he's identified by. So there's that. And look at this. There's a picture here. There is a picture, and they took a thumbprint. What were they doing with the thumbprint? That's all I want to know. Is that technology that was dating that far back? Probably so, but what would you do with it is my question. So here we are. We have a picture of someone's ancestor from that he this was issued in 1920, but he is said to have been 35. So he was born probably 18 um go back 1885. So I think I have it right, 1885. So how cool is that? You know? It was issued, but he applied for it in 1919, excuse me. 5 feet 11 and a half inches. So he's about 6 feet tall. Just I'm just like that rule is very exact, huh? So they were paying attention. And so here's his date of birth. I don't even have to guess. So these are really cool things that you can find. And this is just one page of that document. Like I can go to the next page and find out more information about this person. Um, that they're starting to talk a little bit more about how he was verified. Uh, when, where was he actually, what's his address? Like you have to have a current address, you know, kind of like bring your water bill and show me that you really live here. And then they talk about who appeared. So a Theodore Fitzgerald appeared, and I would go and look into who this person is. And so to see why would he be able to give that kind of information. And the other person was Garfield Brookley. So there's two additional people that are connected to this particular ancestor. And that's why I say these semen records, can go in so much detail. And there's got to be some place where he mentions his parent, um, and I might have missed it. Let's see, father. This says where the father was born here, but some ask for the father's name also, and I can show you one here where. Um, This particular says my father and gives the name of the person and then where they were born, down to the county. So these are very, very valuable. And then you could also look up information about the ship that they were on. There's often a logbook. If you follow the money with seaman work, the chances of you being able to find your ancestor and then also being able to find out what kind of circumstances would happen. Those logbooks, they talk about a lot about the weather, the wind, and everything, but they also talk about if an argument came ensued, maybe a revolt happened. So many things happen in logbooks because they want to be accounted, they want to keep the accounting up to date about what loss happened. Someone spilled a jar of oil that was precious commodity. Um, Something always comes out in those small writings, and that's where we'll find our ancestors' information as well. So this is what I would do. So let me see, did I? Okay, so here's a couple of things. I know I have a lot of things open, but what I wanted to do is just highlight how I got here. So I thought the best way was for me to work backwards. So I'm just pressing my back button here, and um, and I'm gonna press it one more time. And so what I did, okay, one more, was I literally wanted to find records that connected to semen. And so I go to my search bar and I go to the card catalog. And inside of that, I'm looking for keywords like semen. And inside of that particular set, and then I did a thing like I was just really looking at semen records that were in the United States, and I don't have to isolate in that way, but I did. And so I was looking at there's pretty different things, but let's talk about the records that do come up. We have hospital records, the protection certificates, but think about the date range when you're looking for a particular ancestor. And then there's some that are very specific. So we have you, so these are indexes, and this is what I mean. You're not going to find the actual record like we've been looking at it, but just the index that points to the information that was acquired from that record. And then there's something that was really interesting to me. There's even one specific for Rhode Island, and this is another index. I've gone here, but here's the one that really was interesting to me is this that there's almost like a census record just for semen merchants, right? And I want to be very clear that this word semen can be very evasive and very territorial in how people try to classify who's a seaman and who's not. And so I'm identifying the men that were part of these records as seamen, but I'm also not excluding the men that are not on this record that also worked on the water, and I'm also calling them seamen. And that's my decision. Put that out there. So for 1930, you have merchant seaman schedule. And so that's what I'm going to look at right now. And so when I looked at it, from 1930, which is not super far away, a little less than 100 years ago, but we have states that we can look at this collection under, and you'll find in 1930, I don't even see all of my places. Like, where's North Carolina? Huh? Where's North Carolina? I know there's a big body of water there. Where's South Carolina? I don't see that. Right? So these are places where the collections were documented. but it doesn't indicate where the person may have been born. So my advice is to first start to leave that alone unless you find your place and you're interested in that particular kind of data. But if you're looking for someone, perhaps I don't even always put the name. I'm just curious about because so much of my work is connected to using an individual to find out about community. So if you're looking at your birth place. Maybe I'm focused on North Carolina or maybe Edenton, North Carolina. And so that's where I go here. Um, I could put that in directly since we've been talking about Edenton. And I just was search who had a birthplace that was on the schedule. And so while it may not say Edenton, it sure says North Carolina. Right? And so in that, I can see different people that were born in North Carolina were at all these different docks. In 1930, they were at this particular location. And so with seamen and people that are constantly their life work is around moving from one place to the next. It's so essential to start to mark people not just as being born someplace that as a starting point, but just to actually give rise to a better, more fuller story around like where did they go in their lifetime? All right. So in 1930, they could have been here. In 1920, they were somewhere else. In 1935, they were another place, and they had their family in yet another place. But I more than likely they stayed closer to the water regions because they became familiar with that. And so here's some of the ports that they were docked. And so there's a lot of results for this. It's a good chunk of results. I like in between. I'm not looking at a million different results. I like to look at it. And each one, you can take a closer look at what was shown on the record. These are like census records. Okay. So they give you another picture of a seaman that may not have been at the same place as their family, but in the world somewhere. And so that's another window into the Seaman certificate side. And these could also be connected. And so here's the other one where we're here, and this is where I went into the Seaman Protection Certificate between 1960 and 1940. I've also done the one from 17. These are US born seamen, which is slightly different, okay? Because you don't always have to be born. And I'll go into this one here. Um, when you go to the National Archives, one of the things that you'll find is that they had lots of different, this is kind of like the library of semen protection certificates, and many of them are from earlier period of time, which is really cool. And so we have a lot of digitized records here. And so when I start to look at it, and I'm going to enlarge this just a little bit, you can see the Seamen's Protection Certificates, Bureau of Navigation, and the Custom House, which is not filled in, which is not uncommon. But let's take a look inside of it, right? Um, this is just a weight to keep the page down. But we have information. Now, Seaman Certificate, you can see there's like a perforated line here. So this certificate was often given to the seaman, and the receipt book version of what they filled in is left here. And often this is a lot of the information that's given on an index to help us find information about the seaman. And this is from 1918. All right. I just love digging into this a little bit more. And I just put Seamen's Protection Certificate as a search. Here's an affidavit. I think I opened this earlier, but this is someone who is speaking on someone else's behalf. It is kind of difficult to read, but this is from Massachusetts. And I, William Cole of Marblehead in the county of Essex and Commonwealth aforesaid mariner, do solemnly uh, something swear that to the best of my knowledge, I believe Samuel Hodgson was born within the limits of the United States at Scarborough in the state of Massachusetts. So help me God. And they add a little stuff. He was aged 20 years, and such. And it has a dark complexion. I actually am a little bit familiar with, this is a random person, but because I come across these names, I am very familiar with the last name Hodgson. Um, it's just probably stuck out to me because of how it's spelled and how it has gotten me tongue-tied in the past. And so this is this was given on March 30th, 1801. And so oftentimes, and I'm going to stop here, we are searching for family that start at the 1870s or were born or, may just been born a few years before. But we're talking about during a time where slavery was legal. Um, Take that with a grain of salt. And the idea that we are also trying our best to put names to people that were intentionally left nameless. And so often there are also these folders here. And I would suggest if you just have time to comb through. So the thing about the National Archives that is slightly different than, say, an ancestry or family search is you can search by name here. It will not always be, you'll get a lot of, you know, it's like you're looking at the names, so to speak, inside of a record set, but you are not getting a full picture just by searching the archives. I would suggest doing that people search or name search across multiple platforms. So Ancestry, Family Search, uh, National Archives, and even in places that we'll talk about other resources, but other platforms that have databases. Just don't rely on one for it all. So this is a place where we were before. And so I can search for a name here and it will tell me like this image has 272 images and it will actually tell me which image was flagged for my name. And that's helpful. I'm not sure if I have one that's already open, but let's take a look. I did find, and I always use quotation for names. William, oops. Okay, so it took me to a different record set, but I'm familiar with this one. So there in this record set, there are how many records? 166 images. And that could be pretty tedious, given that this is just a file of many different crew lists that arrived at a particular port. So it could be a lot of ships if it's an active port. So over here, it tells me image 90, 92, 97 flagged for that particular name. And so I can go click on that and it'll take me to that page. And in that page, I will find, um, I'll look for the name that I'm actually interested in. And I've already seen it. So it's here. And there's 92 is probably this whole document. Sometimes when you're taking a picture, sometimes the pages are on top of other pages. And even though this isn't the main page, you can see the name. So it flagged it anyway. But if I go to 92, here's the page without anything on top of it, right? So that happens a lot on many different platforms. Um, and it may be for some reason because it's not worth it to just separate all these papers to help keep them in order. However, the process for photographing them. So we have William Richburg. He's a pantry man. I've seen him described in different ways as a mess man, as a waiter. And we have pantry man here. And this is actually my great great grandmother's brother. This is my Uncle William. So, and he's 60, over 60 years old, and it matches that age for him when I first saw him on the ship. He was about that age. And he's African Black. Some places just say African as what is the column? I'm forgetting the name of the column, as the race. They'll say African as the race and American as nationality. And so they have African here, African Black, and then American. And so, but you can also see the different locations that people are who are on the same ship, right? And we're still talking about community. Okay. So we're saying he got to connect with people. Even if you could just say, well, he probably connected with other Black people. These other nationality of African, this person is West Indian. This is African who is considered from Honduras. So we have that um, option available. So I'm going to close out here. Thank you for joining us with Wombs, Wells, and Waterways. And feel free to join us next time on our YouTube channel. Have a blessed day. Remember to subscribe.